Why am I here talking to you tonight? Well, first of all, because Twinkl asked me, but my experience is that I run Autistic Girls Network charity, which is a very small charity which supports autistic girls and women and their families, and also campaigns for earlier diagnosis, particularly of girls, although not only girls, because girls are diagnosed on average about 6 years later than boys, and that has mental health consequences too. I also have 2 autistic and otherwise neurodivergent young people of my own. I wrote a book which was published, I don't know, December 2022, I think, called Nurturing Your Autistic Young Person. I have a master's in autism from Birmingham, and I have personal experience of CAMS and intensive support team, social care, EHCPs, flex learning and specialist schools. Could I have the next slide, please? So first, I'm just going to talk about the language that I'm going to use tonight, because it might be different to the language that you're used to, or it might not. For a start, we don't tend to use the term ASD, although that is the diagnostic term. It is the term in the diagnostic manual, unfortunately. That's because we don't believe that autism is a disorder. We don't believe autistic people are disordered. We also use identity first language. So we say autistic person rather than person with autism. And that's because, first of all, we don't believe that autism is an illness. So, you know, that kind of makes it sound like an illness if you say person with autism. It's also not something that you can extract from somebody. If you're autistic, you've always been autistic from the moment that you were born, and it's part of your identity. That's not to say that it's your whole identity. Of course, we all have multiple identities, but it's certainly part of your identity, and it's very much affects the way that you experience the world. We also don't use functioning labels, so you may have heard the terms high functioning and low functioning, and really we don't use them because, well, for a start, who wants to be called low functioning? But also they're not particularly helpful. They're not particularly helpful in showing what support needs are. So if you said that somebody was high functioning, all of my family really would have been described as high functioning if that had been on diagnoses. There would be times when they definitely wouldn't feel as if they were high functioning. There would be times when they very much struggle. And in fact, although my daughter, for example, would be described as high functioning, she actually has high rate mobility, high rate general living for her PIP, for her personal independence payments. And so in that sense, she certainly isn't high functioning. So we just kind of ignore the functioning labels completely because they're not really very helpful. But that is just us. That's just the language that we use, and we're not trying to make anybody else use that language. But for us, that's the default. Of course, you should always use the language that the autistic person wants you to use. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is our white paper that was published, well, International Women's Day is coming right up, isn't it? So I think 3 years ago now, and it looks at an internal presentation. So when I said about it not being only girls, that was kind of what I meant. Most girls tend to present internally, tend to have an internal profile, but equally so do some boys and certainly some non-binary young people. So it's not only girls that we're talking about. And can I have the next slide, please? So if we're talking about transition to secondary school, there are almost 818,000 11-year-olds in the UK. So that's, you know, a rough figure of how many transition to secondary school every year. Of course, those figures are, you know, possibly inaccurate. There are many pupils now who are having difficulty attending school. There are parents who are pulling their children out to home educate them. So really, who knows? I don't think the government knows how many 11-year-olds there are at school. But certainly over 70% of autistic pupils are in mainstream school rather than specialist, according to government figures. And guidance from the Department of Education says that pupils with SEND should receive extra preparation. Can I have the next slide, please? So let's just think about what is hard for autistic pupils and neurodivergent pupils generally about secondary schools. Let's think about what it's like in primary school. So in primary school, usually you're in one classroom, you're probably with, 30 odd other pupils that you've known for quite a long time, maybe not from the age of 5, but you've probably known most of them for your whole school career. You don't move around the corridors for each lesson. You're going to go to the hall sometimes, you're going to go to dinner, sometimes you're going to go to PE sometimes, but otherwise you probably stay in the same classroom. You have the same teacher who teaches you all your subjects. You have relatively small schools. Of course, there are some large primary schools, but I doubt that there's many primary schools as large as most secondary schools. There aren't that many teachers in the school, depending obviously on how many form intake it is. It's likely that probably you have a safe person at your primary school, whoever it might even be a dinner lady, doesn't matter who it is, as long as it's a safe person. You will know that school very well because you'll have been there for your whole school career, so you won't have trouble navigating it. You'll know exactly where to go, and it won't be a very big school anyway, so it's not likely that you'd be able to get lost anyway. You'll have your own friends. Now, obviously, this is a controversial subject for autistic pupils who can have difficulty making friends. But if we're talking about autistic girls, it is quite likely that they will have some friends. A lot of research has shown that friends are very, very important to autistic girls, and we will talk a little bit more about that later. You're also not likely to have too many strangers walking around a primary school. So when you go to a secondary school, leaving aside for the moment the trauma of any transition for an autistic pupil, you're going to a much, much bigger environment. And much, much bigger means corridors that you have to navigate and find your way around. This can be really stressful for autistic pupils. It can take much longer, depending on obviously your sense of spatial awareness. Certainly you might have a special interest in maps or something, in which case you probably really like finding your way around a new place. But if you don't, that can be a really, really scary thing. I remember when my daughter transitioned to her mainstream secondary school, it was one of the major things that she was really stressed about, finding her way around. There's also going to be more people. So more people means more noise, more smell, more contact in corridors, etc. You're going to be probably in multi-form intake, so there's going to be a lot more people, a lot more classrooms, a lot more things to find your way around. You're going to have to move probably in the corridors for each lesson, the corridors of hell, as I call them. And that means contact with people, and that's hard, and noise. There's going to be a lot more teachers. So, in your primary school, you were used to all the teachers. You'd probably been taught by a lot of them by the time you get to year 6. In secondary school, you're going to have teachers who never teach you. There's going to be a lot of staff, and that means for you, that means a lot of strangers at the beginning. At the beginning, you won't have a trusted or safe person, and we'll talk about that as being a really important part of transition. You're not going to be able to quickly make new friends, so really your comfort level is going to depend on who moves up to secondary school with you. Are any of your friends moving up with you? Can I have the next slide, please? And you're also going to have different kind of lessons. So lessons like science which you probably haven't done to the same extent. And I'm really talking about science labs here. Most primary schools don't have, science labs in the same way that secondary schools have. So that's going to be a new thing. Can be an exciting thing if science is one of your things, but it can also be quite a stressful, unpredictable thing, because you can't tell what's going to happen. People move around, people do science experiments, and unpredictability causes anxiety for autistic pupils. The work is going to be increasingly complicated. The things that you're used to in primary school, you're used to kind of being top of the school when you're in year 6. And yes, work does get more complicated in year 6, but as you get into year 7, it is getting increasingly complicated, isn't it? You might experience stricter teachers. The rules in secondary school do tend to be more strict than in primary school, and obviously that's a generalization, but that can be quite distressing for autistic pupils. Any kind of raised voice, any kind of angry face, any kind of telling off, any kind of detention can be quite anxiety inducing for autistic pupils. You may also have rules which make no sense, and that is not a good thing for an autistic young person. Rules need to make sense if they're expected to be followed, and there may be rules which don't feel like they make any sense. So if that is the case, you do need to explain to that autistic young person why those rules are there. And sometimes that's difficult because there is no sense to them. There's also school uniform, which is likely, and again, this is a generalization, likely to be quite different to primary school. Primary school uniforms tend to be kind of air texture, don't they? And maybe instead of a jumper might be a sweatshirt, things like that. Just generally softer, more comfy than a secondary school uniform. Starting to wear ties and things like that can feel really uncomfortable in a sensory way. But there's also, a lot of other things. If you're a girl and you have to wear tights, that can be really difficult. The seams of tights, etc., can be really difficult. There's lots of reasons why school uniform can be a real issue for autistic pupils. And it can lead to, not actually being able to go to school if there aren't reasonable accommodations made. There's also the unknown. You are leaping into the unknown when you go to a secondary school. And as I said, uncertainty equals anxiety. Transition to secondary school is a whole big lot of uncertainty, quite frankly. Can I have the next slide, please? So, we've gone through those reasons why transition is really difficult. What does a good transition look like for an autistic pupil? And I'm not talking about for any pupil, I'm talking about for an autistic pupil. So basically, a transition program is a set of strategies or resources, isn't it, that's going to make that pupil's change of school easier. It's going to make challenges more manageable. So how do we make challenges more manageable? How do we enable the pupil to feel part of the school as quickly as possible? Those are the things that we need to think about when we're considering a good transition. Can I have the next slide, please? This is a wall with 2 pupils sitting on either side of it. Is that the right slide?
Yeah.
Okay. So when we're trying to piece together a good transition, we need to think about what would stop it being a successful transition. So the kind of things that would stop it would be a lack of peer support. So if you weren't lucky enough to move up with other people from your school, that might be a real problem. When my daughter was transitioning to her school, she came from a feeder primary school. So actually half the class moved up to the same secondary school. And we realized later, because we didn't know that she was autistic when she transitioned, we realized later that moving up with so many people, and in fact having 2 of her best friends in her class, was a real comfort blanket for her. It really helped scaffold her transition. And we have a Facebook group with 22,000 people in it, and we did a survey. I think it was a few years ago now, I think, where we found that the point where most people said that their young person, either their mental health, really reached a crisis point, or they started being unable to go to school, was the February half term of year 7. So they had gone through transition, they'd got to Christmas, they'd come back, and they realized that, it wasn't getting any better. For my daughter, that didn't happen until year 8. And I've talked about this since with her. And yeah, we really believe that it's because she moved up with so many people. And so for those really difficult moments, like, you finish one lesson, you have to get across the school to the next lesson, to the next classroom. For her, if she'd have been on her own, that would have been, a real problem. She may not have been able to do it in those first few weeks, but because she was with her friends who were going to the same class, she could just go with them, and that really scaffolded her. So it's, when you're thinking about individual transition plans for autistic pupils, you do need to think about, or build into them, how much peer support they're going to have at the beginning. Another issue is bullying. There is a huge amount of bullying of autistic pupils. I can't remember the exact percentage in research, but it's as high as 70 or 80% of autistic pupils are bullied at schools. And we get posts about this in our Facebook group, every week. There was one today that said that her child was being bullied, and nothing was happening about it. And basically, they had said you could change schools. That is a real problem if nobody is sticking up for our autistic pupils. So something that really helps with bullying, or against bullying, stopping bullying, giving them, the autistic person, resources to stop bullying, if that is possible, is something that can be built into an individual transition plan. Something else which causes transitions to fail is being over too soon, or not starting early enough. We're going to be talking about some research that we did in the next few slides, and certainly transitions generally need to be much longer than they are. A transition is not one moment in time. For that autistic pupil, that transition could last a year, could last 2 years even. Certainly would be lasting until at least the end of year 7. Also, the last thing really that causes a lot of problems with transitions is a blanket plan for transition. It really does need to be individual, needs to be tailored to that person's needs. And although there may be some blanket things that you might put in place for all neurodivergent pupils, or all pupils with SEND perhaps, there has to be individual elements to it that would help that particular person. Could I have the next slide, please? This slide said our story begins here. So talking about the transition study that we did, all the previous research that I found, I did this as part of my master's, all the previous research that I found included only pupils who'd already had a medical diagnosis of autism in primary school. So our research included pupils who had their diagnosis after they went to secondary school. Also, all of the previous research, and in fact, pretty much all autism research, apart from in the last couple of years, is particularly boy heavy. And then, this is one of the problems that we have with autism research, is for many years, decades, in fact, it has been prevalent that only boys are included in the research, and therefore it's a circular thing. We only find things about boys. But what was happening was that was included as this is what autism is, not this is what autism looks like in boys. And that's why we have so many problems now with a different presentation, a more internal profile of autism not being recognised. Also, none of the previous research had looked at what age the pupils were diagnosed at. They tended, well, most research previously tended to include pupils who'd had very early diagnoses. They had an external presentation of autism, a classical presentation, if you like, and they had been diagnosed very early. So that means, because they got a diagnosis really early, that means they had all those external behaviours of autism that we classically expect. Most autistic girls don't have that. They don't have that external presentation until they can't manage anymore, or until they're in crisis. And that's, we are diagnosing teenagers in crisis at the moment. None of the research previously had recorded if participants had transitioned with their friendship groups. So it hadn't been something that research had picked up. But for us, we found that it really made a difference if they transitioned with friendship groups. So we had 17 participants. There were 13 girls and 4 boys. Not surprising that it was girl heavy, because obviously a lot of our audience, a lot of our Facebook group have girls. 8 of them were diagnosed in primary, 9 were diagnosed in secondary. So that is what we would expect from our cohort. Perhaps it's actually quite high for being diagnosed in primary, the numbers being diagnosed in primary, because our cohort tends to be diagnosed at secondary school, or perhaps even later. 80% of autistic girls remain unrecognised at the age of 18. The youngest had been diagnosed at 5, so she probably presented in an external way at the age of 5. And the 2 oldest girls in the research had been diagnosed at the age of 17. 9 transitioned to secondary school with no diagnosis at all. But 9 of them, not the same 9, interestingly, were on the SEN register. So schools did know that there was something to be looking out for, and this may have made them have a different transition. Could I have the next slide, please? So this has text on it. Hopefully you've got the right slide. So all 17 of our participants, their parents felt that they were more anxious than their peers. And research shows that high levels of psychological distress before transition does put them at a greater risk for a stressful school transition. That's not really surprising, is it? Can I have the next slide, please? So how did it go? What did we find out? Firstly, only 6 of the 17 children were offered a different transition process. So despite the SEN code of practice stating that transition for children with SEN needs deliberate planning and preparation, most of the children did not get this. Sorry, I shouldn't say that, should I? Because only 9 were diagnosed as having SEN. So the majority of those did get it, 3 didn't. Only 3 of the children were diagnosed autistic who were offered a different transition process. Some of the children diagnosed as autistic received the same transition as their peers without SEND, and that also some of them on the SEND register received exactly the same transition as their peers without any SEND. Only 9 of them actually received the transition they had been offered, whether that was tailored or not. So the secondary school didn't follow through on the transition that had been promised. And I'm sure most people here are pretty familiar with autistic pupils and know how important it is to keep your promises. Really, really important to keep your promises if you want to keep trust. 8 of the pupils found the transition easier because of the process that had been put in place. So that, is a really good finding. 5 of those who found the transition easier had been diagnosed at primary school. So they were pupils who the teachers already knew what their presentation was like, already knew probably the things that they found difficult and the things that they were really good at. 13 of the people said that the difficulties for their child had been apparent within the first half term of secondary school, and for most of them it had been almost immediate. Some of them did have an EHCP at secondary. I think only a few of them had an EHCP from primary, but 4 of them had been refused EHCPs. And of course now the statistics are incredibly high for refusal of EHCPs. Something like 98.2% of parents win, if you can say that. I'm using very much inverted commas when I say win. Nobody's winning in this situation, but 98.2% of parents win appeals for EHCPs, which suggests that 98.2% of the time local authorities have acted illegally in not giving the EHCP. Almost half of the parents had been asked to take a parenting course. This is a big bugbear of mine, making referrals, mostly making referrals dependent on taking a parenting course, and often that parenting course not being adapted for neurodivergency at all. Those included parents whose children had been diagnosed both earlier and very late. So regardless of whether they were diagnosed at the age of 5 or diagnosed at the age of 17, the parents had been asked to take a parenting course. Some of the parents, I think it was 6 out of 17, felt that they had been blamed for their child's difficulties. And 2 of those 6 were the parents of the young people not diagnosed until 17 years of age. 7 of the parents had been told that their child needed to be more resilient. And that also included both the young people diagnosed at the age of 17. Can I have the next slide, please? So what did we figure out from our research? What makes a good transition? Well, for a start, as I've mentioned, having an early start to the transition, and I'm talking about, probably before Easter, and making it a long process so that we're not talking about transition as just a one-day event. That is really, really important. Transition can be talked about at primary school from quite early. Secondary school teachers can visit, excuse me, can visit primary schools quite early. They can have visits from autistic pupils or otherwise pupils with SEND quite early. These things can happen much earlier than they usually do because preparation and familiarization are so important for these autistic pupils. They need frequent and lengthier visits, not just visits with the rest of their class. Tours with teachers also really helped, and that could be not only physical tours, but like a little video tour, which they can watch as many times as they want. Some of those found that really helpful. Also, group visits for all neurodivergent pupils in the area, not just from one school, were helpful. Group visits with no other pupils were helpful. I don't know, because obviously I only spoke to the parents. I don't know how the schools arranged that and when they arranged that, when there were no other pupils there. But it's obviously possible because some schools in this survey did it. What else was really good was a detailed and visual description of what to expect. So whenever we do any program or run any group for Autistic Girls Network, we create a really detailed what to expect document, which has lots of pictures in it, pictures of the person, if it's group leaders, etc., pictures of the venue, pictures of what it looks like from outside, pictures of what it looks like inside. Really, really important because everyone processes information in a different way. Really important that you have written and visual descriptions of what is going to happen. What can they expect? What does a typical day look like? What does the school look like? Can we have a map to go from here to there? All of those things are really important. So particularly a map of the school in advance is helpful for some people. I have to say, for me, wouldn't be particularly helpful because my map reading skills are 0. but it was helpful for some of the pupils. Sorry, I don't know why I'm suddenly talking about myself, but equally for my daughter, a map, while it's helpful for preparing it in your head, but it wouldn't have helped her to be able to find her way around the school, if that makes sense. Something else that's really important is co-production. So you can't produce a transition plan that's going to be successful for an autistic pupil if you don't involve that autistic pupil. They need to be involved in it. It needs to be an individual plan. So we need to be talking to the pupil and to their primary school teacher about what we can do to make things better for them. What particular things do they find difficult? Now, they may not know everything because they haven't been to secondary school, and that's why it's important that they have plenty of visits and they have plenty of familiarization, because that might make it easier for them to figure out the things that they're going to find hard. But there will be some things that they just won't be able to predict, because you know what you know, don't you? So if they don't know it exists, they won't be able to say that that's hard. Something else which at Autistic Girls Network we think is really important, and I think is the most important training program that we offer, is a whole school approach to teaching about neurodiversity. I have to say it's not common, but I hope that it's getting more common. The problem with only doing things differently with autistic pupils is that you're constantly trying to make them change. What we shouldn't be trying to make them change. We should be trying to make the school a more inclusive place for them, and that includes other people's attitudes. A lot of the problems that arise from being autistic or being ADHD or being dyslexic are due to other people's attitudes. And while there is still such a stigma to particularly being autistic or being ADHD, it's not going to help. It's not going to stop them being bullied if other people's attitudes haven't changed. So it's really important to start teaching about neurodiversity as a movement. It's important to start teaching about neurodivergency as something that's not medical, not using the medical language of impairment, etc. Talking about difference, not deficit. All of those things are very important. And as many teachers being autism literate is also really important. There's all kinds of things that you can put in place, but it can be spoiled in an instant by a teacher who really doesn't understand, and who suddenly shouts at them, or suddenly chucks them out of a room that they're supposed to be able to go into as a chill out zone. All those kind of things can make all of the work that you've put into making that autistic person feel safe, it can kind of ruin it in an instant. So it's important that as many teachers as possible are autism literate. So, we've just mentioned having a safe space. Sorry, can't speak properly. Having a safe space to go when they're overwhelmed is also really important. And that could be anywhere, could be very individual to the school, but it needs to be a safe place. It needs to be somewhere where they can just chill out, where they're not going to have somebody leaning over them. They're not going to have somebody trying to talk to them all the time, and not having people messing about. All of those things are going to be important. Also, a low sensory arousal environment. Now, that can be a tall order in a big secondary school, but you can do sensory audits. You can walk around the school with your autistic pupils, and find out where are the real trigger points. Have you got a great band of fluorescent lights that are humming? Have you got, is there a place where it's really smelly, like near the dinner hall or something? What are the trigger points for sensory overload? And that you can do a really good sensory audit with your autistic pupils. You don't need to bring in a consultant and pay them loads of money. Do it with them, involve them. They will be really pleased that you have. And lastly, a good relationship with at least one trusted teacher or person. Doesn't have to be a teacher, one trusted member of school staff, at least one, hopefully more than one, because what happens when they're on holiday or they're sick. But it's really important that autistic pupils have somebody to go to that they feel understands them, that they feel have their corner. And that research has shown that that has really made a difference to autistic pupils' well-being in school. Can I have the next slide, please? So what we found also in the research was that what schools thought was important to parents wasn't necessarily what was important to parents of autistic pupils. Academic success didn't really make the list for what was important to the to the parents in our survey. What they found most important, or rather what their children found most important, was friendships. Friendships were really, really important to them, and not having friendships was really, really distressing. Parents were worried about their well-being. They felt that their child having a really high level of anxiety, might make a good transition impossible. They were worried that the school was more concerned with academic progress than the child's well-being. They also wanted to know about social progress. So they didn't just want, on parents' evening or for reports, they didn't just want to know about academic progress. They wanted to know, was their child happy at school? Was their child talking to people at school? Was their child involved in friendships or groups? They wanted to know things like that. And they also were worried about having individualized support, not blanket support. So that was something that was really important to them. Could I have the next slide, please? And relationships and friendships definitely was, the top kind of thing that autistic pupils were worried about. So we've talked about moving up with friends, being a comfort and being a scaffold. And yeah, they definitely liked that. And I'm sure, to be fair, I'm sure all pupils would rather move up with their friends than go to a new school entirely on their own. That's a scary thing, isn't it? Even as an adult, that's a scary thing. Relationships, though, whether with pupils or whether with staff, were critically important for the autistic pupils. They needed to know that they were building a connection. And so we're back to having that safe person. And obviously friendships should be safe people too. They aren't always. We know that teenage and preteen friendships, perhaps particularly among girls, can be choppy water, can't they? But relationships were really, really important to autistic pupils, and a good relationship could be crucial to having a happy school life. They're also a cushion against bullying. Over half of the pupils in our survey had reported that they had been bullied. And also thinking about the friends that they left behind who didn't move to that school with them. If they've parted from a good friend, they may actually be grieving at transition time, because there is a myth that we know that autistic people don't feel empathy. It's pretty, I consider it absolute rubbish, that myth. A lot of autistic young people, or a lot of autistic people generally, can be hyper empathetic, so really feel hyper empathy, perhaps even take on other people's emotions, even though they may not actually be able to recognize those emotions. And so they can really, really feel being taken away from a good friend, and that may take time to recover from. But one of their paramount needs for autistic pupils, and this is across all research, not just our research, is not to stand out, to fit in, to belong. Really, really important. And in order to belong, you need friends, you need peer acceptance, you need to feel as if you're listened to and you're treated respectfully. Autistic pupils do tend to have less friends and to find it more difficult to make friends than their neurotypical peers. So, it's kind of doubly difficult because it's really, really important to them, but actually it's harder. And it does get more complicated in secondary school, of course, compared to primary school, because you're suddenly split into different groups for lessons, streaming, all that kind of thing. It suddenly starts becoming more complicated. So how can schools kind of facilitate acceptance, or peer acceptance? Well, I would suggest, listening to parents who know their child best, listening to that primary school teacher is really, really important. And that's going to help you to create the bespoke strategies for that pupil, for that individual pupil, not a blanket policy. Research shows that new secondary pupils are double as likely to have problems if they move to a school where they don't have any siblings or cousins, was the actual research, but I suggest that good friends could be equal to that. So if you do have an autistic pupil who's moving up, without any connections in the school, then it's certainly merits keeping an extra eye on them. More research, I think, really needs to be done into the impact of moving up with friends, because that could make quite a difference, although obviously it's not something that you can control. People choose the school or get allocated to the school that they do, and there's not really much you can do about it. Can I have the next slide, please? So what are the conclusions from our study? Well, given the importance of planning and preparation, that certainly needs to be something that's really thought about. If you don't have that planning and preparation, if you don't have a different transition and a bespoke transition according to your needs, then you're immediately at a disadvantage. Both of the girls that were diagnosed at 17 in our research had been refused a diagnosis earlier. So had basically been misdiagnosed earlier. And they had both had a very unsuccessful and very difficult transition, and subsequently a very difficult school career up to the age of 17. Neither of them were offered any extra transition strategies, and they said that the transition process they had didn't help them. It was obvious for both of them that they were having difficulties within the very first week of secondary school. So for pupils like these, it's really important that school staff understand and recognise autism. We're back to being autism literate again. And that was definitely one of the themes that emerged in the literature review for this research. If there had been better understanding, particularly at primary school, then these girls would not have waited until after they were 17 and their school career was pretty much over before they were recognised as autistic. And it's particularly galling given that they had been referred and they had got refused a diagnosis. That was obviously wrong. For those who haven't got a diagnosis at the time of transition, as long as the primary school has identified some needs, obviously you can't give a bespoke transition as if nobody's ever said anything and nobody's ever realised that they might be autistic. There still needs to be additional planning and preparation with an autism knowledgeable team when questions have been raised at primary school. And a tailored transition plan should be needs based, not according to a diagnosis. So whether a diagnosis is in place or not, we know how long it takes. We know how long the waiting lists are, up to 5 years in some areas. We can't be waiting for a diagnosis. In this study, the pupils with the most tailored, the most individual transition plan enjoyed the most successful transitions, as you would expect. Only one respondent gave the highest possible score for their transition experiences, and that was the one who had been diagnosed at 5 years old. Perhaps not a surprise. Obviously, there had been years of records for this pupil. They knew what they found difficult, they knew what they found easy, and the transition plan could be tailored to them. And the parent said that it was. The parent said the transition process had been tailored to her daughter's needs. There was another parent whose child had been diagnosed autistic at 12, but who was on the SEN register at the time of transition, said that the transition planning had been really good and it was vital to the success, and it had spanned 2 years. So that transition, 2 years. So, a good transition is not a short-term thing. It wasn't diagnosis that made a difference for them, but it was needs-based planning that created a successful transition, and knowing that the child had some kind of SEND, even though it hadn't actually been diagnosed. Can I have the next slide, please? So among the schools that were mentioned in the survey, there was a real mix of support that had been offered, but only 3 schools out of the 17 did it really well. And they used tailored support, like a key worker taking the child into the school for extra visits, map games. I never found out what kind of map games they were. I think I'd like to find out, really. But map games to find classrooms. Slightly strange, trampolining lessons. So I think they created some kind of after-school club that was only for neurodivergent children who were going to be coming to the school, and they did trampolining lessons. So obviously it could be anything, doesn't have to be trampolining, but it was creating an activity that got everyone together so that they actually could meet other autistic pupils before they came to the school, and that was really good. Another one created a photo scrapbook and sent that scrapbook to the young person before they came to the school. So they really had photographic evidence of what the school was going to look like and what kind of things happened there. But some of the young people were offered nothing. Even some of those diagnosed as autistic were offered nothing. And in some cases, the transition failed and the child's mental health did start to deteriorate. Can I have the next slide, please? So in this research, I actually assumed that those who were diagnosed in primary would have a better transition, but actually the results were mixed. The data supports the idea that rather than diagnosis, it's an understanding of each pupil's needs and individual support to bridge the transition with supportive relationships and understanding and accommodation of autism by the secondary staff, which are the most important factors. And only 3 of the 17 schools did well in those criteria. Can I have the next slide, please? Oh, I think I'm just about on time, Helen. So this is almost my last slide, so I reckon I've done okay. I've kept in the time. So what I would really like you to take away from tonight and from all of the sessions that I'm going to be doing for Twinkl is, if you're neurotypical, if you're not neurodivergent, consider that the way that you think is not the right way, but just one of many right ways. It's the majority way. And we're going to be talking at other sessions. There isn't time to talk about it now. We're going to be talking about the double empathy problem and how it's miscommunication on both sides, which cause misunderstandings around being autistic, around communication issues and social issues, and opening your mind to a different way of people experiencing the world is really, really important. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is my book. I don't actually know why it's there. I don't really want to talk about it. I'm not going to sell it to you. So let's move to the next slide. And this is just some links of where you can find out more about Autistic Girls Network. And there are lots and lots of resources on the website, including free downloads. And there is a school passport on there, which might be useful.